Ethan Cole walked down the narrow aisle of the airplane with his daughter Lily holding his hand. It was late at night and both of them were tired. Lily clutched her small backpack close to her chest, her eyes wide as she looked around at the rows of passengers finding their seats. Ethan carried a worn jacket over his arm and looked like a man carrying many heavy thoughts. They reached row 12. Ethan helped Lily climb into her seat by the window, and then sat down beside her. He gave her a soft smile. "You good, kiddo?" he asked. Lily nodded quickly. She pressed her forehead against the cool window and stared at the lights on the runway. Ethan leaned back and closed his eyes. He had been running on very little sleep for weeks. Raising Lily alone was hard, but he never complained in front of her. He had promised himself that she would feel safe no matter how tired he was. Tonight, though, his body gave in. His eyes grew heavier and heavier until he drifted off into a deep sleep. The plane hummed as it taxied across the runway. Flight attendants checked seat belts and smiled at passengers. Somewhere near the front of the plane, Captain Claire Monroe was preparing for takeoff. She wore her uniform with calm pride, her voice steady as she spoke into the radio. Claire had flown for years, but every takeoff still carried weight. She checked her instruments again and again. Behind her professional focus was a quiet loneliness she never showed to anyone. Lily turned her head and looked at her father. He was asleep already, his chin tilted to the side. She sighed softly. She missed her mother, though she did not say it out loud. She loved her father more than anything, but she sometimes wished he did not look so tired all the time. Lily hugged her backpack and closed her eyes as the plane lifted into the sky. The cabin lights dimmed. Most passengers settled into silence. Some whispered to each other. Some pulled blankets over themselves. A few scrolled on their phones. The steady hum of engines filled the space, like a blanket of sound. Ethan's breathing grew even as he sank deeper into sleep. Captain Claire guided the plane smoothly into the night. The sky outside was dark and wide. She kept her hands on the controls, focused, calm, steady. Her co-pilot spoke about weather patterns ahead, and she nodded with quick precision. They were both skilled, but Claire carried the weight of every soul on board like a quiet promise to herself. Back in row 12, Lily fidgeted with the straps of her backpack. She glanced at her father again. She wanted to wake him and talk, but she stopped herself. Now, she knew he needed rest. Instead, she pressed her hand lightly against his arm. Even in his sleep, his presence made her feel safe. The night grew deeper. The plane cut through pockets of thin clouds. In the cabin, time stretched in the slow rhythm of long travel. The world outside was silent, yet inside the plane, life moved quietly from row to row. Ethan remained asleep, unaware of the storm waiting ahead. Lily kept her eyes on the stars that peeked through the window, her thoughts floating like small birds. Then in the cockpit, Claire Monroe glanced briefly at the seat beside her. She had flown with many co-pilots, many crews, and many passengers hidden behind the cabin doors. Yet sometimes she wondered if among them there was someone who carried the same invisible weight she did. Tonight, without knowing, her path had already crossed with one of them. The flight seemed ordinary, yet the strings of fate had already started to pull. Ethan slept in row 12, his daughter beside him, and Claire sat at the controls in the front. None of them knew that by the time the night ended, their lives would never be the same. The flight moved on through the quiet night sky. Most passengers sat still, some reading, some trying to sleep. The hum of the engines carried a steady rhythm. In row 12, Ethan remained asleep, while Lily leaned against him, her small head resting on his shoulder. She tried to feel brave, but her eyes kept moving toward the windows where the dark clouds seemed closer now. In the cockpit, Captain Claire Monroe adjusted the controls. Her co-pilot, Daniel, reached for a switch, and then froze. His hand shook suddenly, his face turned pale. Claire turned her head quickly, and asked if he was all right. Daniel opened his mouth as if to answer, but no words came. His body went rigid, and he slumped against his seat. Claire called his name in a sharp voice, but he did not respond. Her pulse quickened. She pressed a button and called for help from the cabin crew. A flight attendant rushed forward, but there was little she could do. Claire kept her hands steady on the controls while her mind raced. Flying the plane alone in calm weather was possible, but she knew the storm ahead would not forgive a single mistake. She needed someone who understood more than basic instructions. She needed another pilot. Claire lifted the microphone with a firm hand. Her voice came over the intercom. "This is your captain speaking. If there's a pilot on board, please make yourself known at once." Her words echoed down the length of the cabin. Passengers stirred in confusion. Whispers spread quickly. Some looked around with wide eyes. Others pressed the call buttons to ask the attendants what was happening. Fear rose like a wave through the rows. Lily opened her eyes and blinked. She had heard the captain's voice clearly. She tugged on her father's arm. "Daddy, wake up," she whispered. Ethan stirred, but he was slow to open his eyes. "Daddy, the captain is asking for a pilot." Her voice carried a note of worry that cut through his sleep. Ethan sat up, rubbing his eyes. He looked at her, confused. "What did you say?" Lily repeated herself louder this time. He looked toward the ceiling where the intercom had fallen silent. His heart began to pound. Memories stirred in his chest, memories he had tried to bury deep. Years ago, he had flown through storms and skies. He had lived for the sound of engines, but those days had ended when he walked away from that life. Around him, passengers were murmuring. Some were anxious, some were frightened. All were waiting for someone to stand. Ethan's hands tightened on his knees. He shook his head as if trying to clear the thought. He had promised himself never to return to that world. But Lily's small eyes were fixed on him, wide and filled with hope and fear. The flight attendants moved quickly down the aisle, asking if anyone could help. No one raised a hand. No one spoke up. The silence grew heavy. Lily touched her father's arm again. "Daddy," she said softly, "you can help." Those words pressed on his heart harder than the weight of all the stairs around him. Ethan drew a slow breath. He felt the old strength inside him, the one he had tried to bury. He arose from his seat. The people nearby turned their heads at once. Some gasped quietly. The flight attendant looked at him with surprise and relief. "Sir, are you a pilot?" she asked quickly. He hesitated before answering. "Yes," he said at last, his voice low but clear. "I was a pilot." The attendant nodded sharply and gestured for him to follow. Lily held his hand tight before letting go, her small fingers slipping away as she watched him stand tall for the first time in a long while. Ethan walked down the aisle toward the cockpit. The eyes of the passengers followed him, filled with both fear and hope. Behind the closed door at the front, Claire Monroe gripped the controls and waited. She did not know yet that the man from row 12 would change everything about this night and about her life. Ethan stepped into the cockpit with a heavy heart. The hum of the controls filled the small space. Captain Claire Monroe looked at him, her eyes sharp but steady. She was holding the plane level, but the tension in her jaw showed how serious the moment was. Beside her, the co-pilot remained, slumped in his seat, a crew member trying to check his pulse and keep him stable. Claire spoke quickly, her voice clear. "Are you trained?" Ethan gave a short nod. "Air Force," he said. "But I left years ago." Her eyes stayed on him for only a second before turning back to the instruments. "Then you know enough," she said. "I cannot do this alone with the storm ahead." She moved her hand from one set of controls and gestured for him to take the other. Ethan sat down, his body stiff, as if he was fighting against himself. His hands rested on the controls, and for a moment, he felt the old weight of flying return to him. He had thought that part of his life was buried. Yet now the switches, the screens, the sound of the engines, all came back like they had never left him. Claire kept her eyes forward, her voice low but firm. "The weather ahead is turning bad. We need steady hands." Ethan nodded and checked the readings. He began to speak the numbers out loud, his voice growing clearer. She listened and matched his rhythm. For the first time, they worked as a pair, though they had never met before. In the cabin, passengers held onto their seats as the first drops of turbulence shook the plane. Lily clutched her backpack, her eyes fixed on the cockpit door. She believed in her father, even though she had never seen this side of him before. Her small heart beat faster, but she whispered to herself that he would keep her safe. Inside the cockpit, the air grew tight. Ethan looked at Claire from the side. She was calm, focused, and strong. Her hands moved quickly but with purpose. He could see the years of experience in her movements. She noticed his steady breathing returning, his shoulders loosening as he adjusted to the role again. For the first time that night, she felt a hint of relief. "Why did you leave it behind?" Claire asked suddenly. her voice almost drowned by the sound of the engines. Ethan hesitated, his jaw tightened. "My wife passed away," he said. "I had Lily to raise. Flying felt like another world I could not go back to." His words were plain, but the weight behind them was heavy. Claire did not press further. She only gave a short nod, her eyes showing respect. The storm loomed on the radar ahead. Lightning flashed in the distance, brief but bright. The plane shook harder now. Ethan gripped the controls, his muscles tense. Claire guided him with short instructions, and he answered with sharp focus. Their voices filled the cockpit like two parts of one sound. In that moment, Ethan realized he was not alone. The fear that had always sat inside him felt lighter. Claire's presence beside him made the task feel possible. She carried her own silence, her own hidden weight, but she never let it break her focus. He respected her strength, and something deep inside him stirred, like a hidden string being touched for the first time. The plane cut into the edge of the storm. Rain lashed against the windows. Thunder rolled through the night sky. In the cabin, people gasped as the plane jolted. Some prayed, some closed their eyes, and some clung to loved ones. Lily pressed her face against her hands, but peeked between her fingers to see if her father would return to her. Claire and Ethan worked side by side, guiding the plane through the dark sky. He spoke readings. She adjusted the path, and together they fought against the storm. Neither of them said it, but both felt it. A bond had begun in that moment, drawn tight by danger, by trust, and by something greater they could not yet name. The storm grew heavier as the plane pressed forward. The wings shuddered under the force of the wind. Lightning flashed again, close enough to light the cockpit for a brief second. Ethan kept his hands steady on the controls, his jaw set. Claire leaned forward, eyes sharp on the instruments, giving quick directions. Together they kept the aircraft level, while the storm pushed hard against them. In the cabin, passengers were frightened. Some held hands across the aisles, others whispered hurried words, trying to stay calm. Lily sat straight in her seat, her eyes fixed on the cockpit door. Her small hands gripped the straps of her backpack. She wanted to be brave because she knew her father was inside, helping the captain. She whispered to herself that he would not let anything happen. Back in the cockpit, Ethan called out readings. Claire adjusted the course by a few degrees. They spoke in short bursts, their voices firm, their breathing heavy. The sound of the storm outside filled the space, but their focus never broke. For every strong gust, they leaned into the challenge together. A sudden jolt shook the aircraft harder than before. Warning lights blinked across the panel. Claire's fingers moved quickly, steady as she flipped switches. Ethan checked the gauges and gave her the numbers. "One engine is straining," he said in a flat voice. She nodded, eyes narrowing. "We can hold it. Do not let the nose dip." He steadied the controls, his knuckles white with effort. Minutes felt longer than hours. Every second demanded their full strength. Claire's calmness never slipped, even as the storm pressed harder. Ethan looked at her briefly and saw in her expression not only skill but also courage. She carried the lives of everyone on board without fear. He felt respect grow inside him, and with it, a strange comfort that he was not facing this alone. Claire spoke between movements. "You fly like someone who never stopped?" Ethan shook his head. "I stopped the day I buried my wife." His voice was rough, but he kept his eyes forward. Claire's hands paused for a fraction of a second, then continued. "But you came back tonight," she said. Her words cut through the noise like a sharp light. He glanced at her, and for a moment, he felt seen in a way he had not felt for years. The plane rattled again as a strong gust hit. Ethan held firm, his arms burning from the pressure. Claire guided him through the worst of it, her voice calm, precise, steady. Together they pulled the aircraft higher, breaking through the thickest clouds. The shaking lessened, though rain still streamed across the glass. In the silence that followed, both of them breathed hard. For the first time since entering the cockpit, Ethan felt a sliver of hope. Claire leaned back for a moment, her eyes still on the path ahead. "We will get through this," she said simply. He nodded, his voice low. "Not without you." Their words lingered in the small space like an unspoken promise. In the cabin, passengers noticed the turbulence was easing. Fear lessened slightly, though many still sat with tight hands and tense shoulders. Lily leaned toward the aisle, her eyes searching. She wished she could see her father again, but she held on to the belief that he was safe because the plane was still steady. Back in the cockpit, Ethan adjusted a dial. Claire glanced at him, her eyes softer now, though her face remained firm. There was something in the way they worked together that felt natural, as if they had done this for years. Neither of them spoke it out loud, but they both felt it. A line had been drawn between them, not by choice, but by the storm that demanded they stand together. Outside the window, the storm still waited with more trials ahead. But inside the cockpit, trust had taken root. For Ethan, it felt like the first time in years that he was not carrying the sky alone. For Claire, it was the first time she had let someone else share the weight she had always held by herself. The storm did not end quickly. Clouds grew darker, and the rain hit harder. Lightning streaked across the sky with sharp flashes. The plane shook again, and warning sounds echoed through the cockpit. Ethan and Claire stayed locked in focus, their voices steady as they worked side by side. A light flashed on the control panel. Claire's eyes narrowed. "Landing gear is jammed," she said. Ethan checked the instruments and confirmed it. The system showed an error. If they could not release the landing gear, touching down would be almost impossible. The risk for everyone on board grew larger by the second. In the cabin, fear rose again. Passengers whispered and some began to cry. Lily pressed her forehead against the window, her breath fogging the glass. She looked toward the cockpit door, wishing she could hear her father's voice. She hugged her backpack tighter and whispered, "Come back safe." Inside the cockpit, Claire tried to override the system, but the controls did not respond. She slammed her hand lightly against the panel in frustration. Ethan leaned forward, scanning the gauges. "Manual release might work," he said. Claire nodded quickly. "We will need to hold steady long enough to try it." The storm gave them little room for error, yet they had no choice. Ethan took the controls while Claire reached for the emergency lever. She pulled hard, her muscles straining. The lever resisted, stuck from the pressure. Ethan steadied the plane against a strong gust, his voice firm. "Pull again." She gritted her teeth and yanked with all her strength. At last the lever gave way with a loud click. A new light blinked green on the panel. The landing gear had unlocked. Both of them breathed in sharp relief. Claire looked at him, her eyes bright with determination. "You held it steady when it mattered most." Ethan shook his head. "You made it possible." Their words carried respect. But under the surface, there was something stronger growing between them. The storm still battered the wings. The plane dipped sharply before Ethan corrected the angle. Claire steadied the path beside him, her hand brushing close to his, as they shared the same set of controls. Their movements were not just skill, but trust. For every small decision, they leaned on each other. Ethan's thoughts flickered to Lily. He pictured her waiting just behind the cockpit door. That image kept his focus sharp. Claire noticed the quiet fire in his eyes. She had flown with many co-pilots, but none had carried such purpose. For him, it was not only about flying, it was about protecting the one person who meant the world to him. The plane jolted once more as thunder cracked nearby. Claire steadied her breath. "Ethan," she said in a low voice, "you are not alone in this." Her words sank deep into him. He glanced at her, and in her eyes he saw more than a captain. He saw someone who carried her own battles yet chose to stand strong for others. That truth struck him like lightning of its own kind. Together they guided the plane clear of the heaviest clouds. The sky outside began to thin, though the air was still rough. For the first time, stars appeared between breaks in the storm. Ethan and Claire both felt the shift. The worst of the fight might be behind them, but the landing still waited ahead. In the cabin, passengers noticed the calmer air. Some sighed in relief, though none knew the real danger that had almost torn their fate apart. Lily's eyes softened as she felt the plane steady. She whispered to herself again, "I knew you could do it, Daddy." Her faith wrapped around Ethan like an invisible shield. In the cockpit, silence stretched for a few breaths. Ethan and Claire did not need to speak. They both knew something had formed between them in the middle of the storm. It was more than teamwork, more than chance. It was a bond neither of them had expected. And it was only growing stronger as the night carried them closer to the ground. The storm finally began to break apart. Clouds thinned, and the night sky showed stars once more. The engines hummed, still strained, but holding steady. Ethan kept his eyes fixed on the runway coordinates that were glowing on the display. Claire adjusted the course with sharp movements, her hands steady and sure. They had made it through the storm, but the hardest part was still waiting. The landing would decide everything. In the cabin, passengers held a quiet tension. Some leaned back with relief, others prayed silently. Lily pressed her small face against the window and saw lights far below. Her heart leaped. She knew they were close to the ground, but she also knew that her father was still in the cockpit, carrying the weight of everyone on board. Claire's voice cut through the silence of the cockpit. "The runway is clear. The tower is ready. Gear is down, but we must handle the crosswinds." Ethan nodded, his grip tightening on the controls. The storm had weakened, but sharp winds still swept across the airport. One mistake could send them off course. Both of them knew this was the final test. Ethan spoke with steady breath. "Take it together." Claire gave a small nod. Together, their voices matched in strength, carrying a promise that neither had spoken before. The plane began its descent. The lights of the runway grew brighter through the windshield. The air grew rough again as the winds pushed against them. Ethan adjusted, Claire balanced. The plane dipped once, then steadied. Warning sounds blinked on the panel, but both of them ignored the noise. Their focus was locked on the ground rushing up to meet them. In row 12, Lily held her breath. She clutched the straps of her backpack with all her strength. Around her, passengers braced themselves, some whispering prayers, some closing their eyes. The silence before the landing felt longer than the storm itself. Inside the cockpit, Ethan's mind raced. He remembered nights when he had flown alone, nights when he had thought the sky would break him. But this night was different. Claire's presence beside him kept his hands steady. He glanced at her, and for a second their eyes met. It was not just trust now. It was something deeper, a bond that had formed without words. He turned back to the runway, his focus sharpened by that feeling. Claire guided the throttle. "Hold it steady. Do not fight the wind. Let it pass through." Her voice was calm, certain. Ethan adjusted his hands, feeling the weight of her guidance. The plane lowered. The ground came closer. The roar of the engines filled the cabin. The wheels touched the runway with a hard jolt. The plane bounced once, then steadied under their control. The brakes roared. The body of the aircraft shuddered as it slowed. Ethan and Claire worked in perfect rhythm, pulling the plane down to a safe roll. When the speed dropped and the runway stretched quiet ahead of them, the entire cabin erupted in cheers. Passengers clapped and cried with relief. Some hugged each other. Lily pressed her hands together in joy, her eyes shining with pride. She whispered, "He did it," though in her heart she knew it was not just him. It was also the captain who had stood with him. Ethan leaned back in his seat, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. Claire rested her hands on the controls for a moment before letting them go. The silence between them was filled with more than exhaustion. It was filled with something unspoken that both of them felt. Claire turned her head slightly. "You never stopped being a pilot," she said in a low voice. Ethan looked at her, his eyes tired but alive. "Not without you," he answered. Their words carried no softness, only truth. In that moment, the soul string between them pulled tighter than ever before. In the cabin, the flight attendants announced the safe landing. The passengers cheered again, but the sound seemed far away to Ethan and Claire. Both of them knew that this night had tied them together in a way that could not be undone. The runway stretched ahead, but for them it was the start of something far greater than the flight they had just survived. The plane rolled to a stop at the end of the runway. The cabin lights glowed brighter, and the sound of the engines softened. Passengers let out long breaths, some with tears on their faces, some holding hands tightly as if they had just woken from a nightmare. The flight attendants moved down the aisle with calm voices, asking people to remain seated. Relief hung in the air like a heavy curtain finally lifting. Ethan sat back in the cockpit, his hands resting on his knees. Sweat dampened his forehead, and his chest rose and fell as he caught his breath. Claire sat beside him, her uniform neat but her eyes showing the weight of what they had just endured. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence felt alive, as if words would never be enough to explain what had passed between them in the storm. Then Claire looked at him. "You saved them," she said simply. Ethan shook his head. "We saved them. Their eyes held each other's for a long second. It was not just respect that passed between them. It was recognition, a sense that their lives had been pulled into the same line by something far greater than chance. The cockpit door opened and a flight attendant stepped in. "The passengers are calm now," she said. "Everyone is safe." Claire gave a short nod. "Good." The attendant looked at Ethan with gratitude before leaving again. Ethan stood slowly, his body stiff from the hours of strain. He thought of Lily waiting just behind the door. His heart beat faster, not with fear now, but with the need to see her face. When he stepped out into the cabin, Lily was already on her feet. She ran down the aisle before anyone could stop her and wrapped her arms around him. Ethan lifted her up, holding her tight against his chest. "I knew you would do it, Daddy," she whispered. His eyes burned, but he held his voice steady. "I did not do it alone." He looked back toward the cockpit where Claire was standing in the doorway, watching quietly. Passengers began to clap again, louder this time. Some thanked him as he passed, some simply nodded with tears in their eyes. Ethan carried Lily down the aisle, her small arms still wrapped around his neck. Claire followed, speaking briefly to the crew, before stepping out into the terminal lights. The airport was crowded with officials and reporters waiting by the gate. Questions flew through the air, but Ethan ignored them. His only focus was Lily, who now rested her head against his shoulder. Claire answered a few sharp questions with calm authority, her voice steady as always. She kept her eyes away from the flashing cameras, choosing instead to glance toward Ethan. When the noise quieted and the passengers were guided out, Ethan found himself standing with Claire near the edge of the terminal. For a moment, the world felt still again. Lily looked between them, a small smile forming on her lips. She tugged at Ethan's sleeve and then pointed to Claire. "She should fly with us again," she said. Her voice was simple, but it carried more weight than she could know. Claire bent slightly and met Lily's eyes. "Your father is very brave," she said. "He carried more than the sky tonight." Lily smiled wider. Ethan looked at Claire, his voice rough but clear. "I could not have done it without you." Claire's lips curved just enough to show the hint of a smile. "I could not have done it without you." They stood in silence for a moment longer. Neither spoke of fate, yet both felt it. Something had drawn them together on that night, something that went beyond chance, beyond storms, beyond fear. It was a bond tied not with words but with trust, courage, and the invisible string that pulled two souls toward each other. Ethan shifted Lily in his arms and started to walk toward the exit. Claire watched them for a moment before stepping beside him. They moved together through the lights of the terminal, not as strangers who had survived a flight, but as two people whose lives had been tied together by the sky. The night that began in fear had ended in connection, and neither of them would ever walk the same path again.